town of Ashford Hollow sat nestled between rolling Pennsylvania hills, where autumn fog clung to the valleys like a burial shroud. In 1858, it was a place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and reputation was everything. The Cole family lived in a modest white house adjacent to the First Methodist Chapel, a building that had stood for nearly a century, its wooden beams creaking with the weight of countless prayers and confessions. Reverend Samuel Cole had served the community for 12 years. He was a tall man with kind eyes and calloused hands, from helping parishioners repair their homes until their fields. His wife Margaret had died giving birth to their only child, Nathaniel, 7 years prior. The Reverend raised the boy alone, pouring all his love and devotion into the child who carried his late wife's dark eyes and delicate features. Nathaniel was an unusually quiet boy. While other children ran through the streets, laughing and playing games, he preferred to sit in the chapel's back pew, watching his father prepare sermons. The townspeople found him peculiar but harmless, a shy, withdrawn child who simply needed time to emerge from his shell. They attributed his silence to growing up without a mother's touch. But there were signs. Small things that people later remembered with chilling clarity. The way Nathaniel stared at injured animals without flinching. The time he asked his father with genuine curiosity what it felt like to stop breathing. The drawings found hidden beneath his bed, crude sketches of figures with red marks across their throats. Samuel dismissed these concerns whenever they were raised. His son was sensitive, he explained. The boy had witnessed a stillborn calf at the Henderson farm and was simply trying to understand death, a natural curiosity for a child who'd never known his mother. The drawings were just a phase. Every child went through periods of morbid fascination. In late September, 3 weeks before the incident, things began to escalate. Mrs. Abernathy, the schoolteacher, noticed Nathaniel sitting alone during recess, methodically pulling the wings off flies and arranging their bodies in neat rows on the windowsill. When she approached him, he looked up with those dark, unblinking eyes and asked if she thought the flies knew they were dying. She reported this to Samuel that afternoon. The Reverend sat across from her in the parlor, his face drawn with worry he tried to hide behind reassuring words. He promised to speak with Nathaniel, to guide him toward more appropriate interests. Mrs. Abernathy left unconvinced, but she trusted the Reverend's judgment. Everyone did. That evening, Samuel found his son in the small garden behind their house. Nathaniel was crouched beside a wounded bird, watching it struggle. The Reverend knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "We should help it, son," Samuel said softly. "End its suffering mercifully." Nathaniel turned to look at his father. "Why would we do that?" "I want to see how long it takes." The Reverend's blood ran cold, but he maintained his composure. He picked up the bird and snapped its neck quickly, then buried it while Nathaniel watched in silence. That night, Samuel prayed longer than usual, asking God for guidance in raising a child he was beginning to fear he didn't truly know. The next morning, the bird's grave had been disturbed. The small body lay on Nathaniel's windowsill, positioned as if in flight. When confronted, the boy simply said he wanted to keep it. He didn't understand what he'd done wrong. Samuel began to notice other changes. Nathaniel's drawings became more detailed, more disturbing. He stopped eating meals with his father, preferring to take his food to his room. He started talking to himself, or to someone. In whispered conversations Samuel couldn't quite hear through the bedroom door. The Reverend consulted medical books, searching for explanations. Perhaps the boy had a fever affecting his mind. Perhaps he needed discipline, structure, boundaries he'd been too lenient to enforce. Samuel tried everything he could think of, but Nathaniel only retreated further into whatever dark place had claimed his thoughts. October arrived with unseasonable cold. Frost painted the windows of Ashford Hollow each morning, and the townspeople spoke of an early winter. Samuel Cole's sermons took on a desperate quality, passionate pleas about salvation, redemption, and the power of faith to overcome darkness. His congregation assumed he was inspired by the changing season, unaware he was preaching to an audience of one, his son, who sat in that back pew with the same blank expression he wore everywhere else. On October 3rd, young Thomas Whitmore went missing. The 8-year-old had been playing near the creek that ran behind the church when he vanished. The entire town mobilized. searching the woods and fields until nightfall. They found him the next morning, alive but deeply shaken, hiding in the old mill 2 miles outside town. Thomas wouldn't speak at first. His parents held him, grateful beyond words, while Sheriff Morrison tried gently to learn what had happened. Finally, the boy whispered that someone had followed him to the creek, someone who told him about a special place where children went after they died, someone who wanted to show him how to get there. When asked who this person was, Thomas looked directly at Nathaniel Cole, who stood with his father among the searchers. The boy's face showed no reaction to the accusation. He simply stared back at Thomas with those dark, emotionless eyes until Samuel hurriedly led him away, apologizing profusely and insisting there must be some mistake. The sheriff visited the Cole house that afternoon. He was a fair man, reluctant to believe that the Reverend's son could be capable of such a thing, but duty required investigation. Samuel sat across from him in the study, hands clasped tightly, while Nathaniel remained upstairs. "Thomas is a good boy, Reverend," Morrison said carefully. "Not prone to lying or flights of fancy. His parents confirm he's never met your son before yesterday. So I have to ask, where was Nathaniel when the Whitmore boy went missing?" Samuel's throat constricted. "He was here, with me, helping prepare for Sunday's service." It was a lie. Nathaniel had been out for hours that afternoon, and Samuel hadn't known where. The boy had returned just before the search party formed, his clothes damp and muddy, offering no explanation for his absence. But Samuel couldn't bring himself to voice these truths. Protecting his son had become instinct, even as doubt gnawed at his conscience. The sheriff nodded slowly, wanting to believe. "I'm sure it was just confusion. The boy was frightened, probably saw someone else, but Samuel—" He paused, choosing his words. "There's been talk about Nathaniel. People notice things. Mrs. Abernathy, the Henderson boys, now this. If there's something wrong, something we can help with, you need to tell us." "He's just a quiet child," Samuel insisted, his voice strained. "Growing up without a mother hasn't been easy. He'll grow out of this phase." Morrison left unconvinced, and Samuel knew the protection his position had afforded his son was eroding. That night, he confronted Nathaniel directly, demanding the truth about what happened at the creek. The boy sat on his bed, hands folded in his lap, and said simply that he'd wanted to make a friend. Thomas had been scared for no reason. He hadn't done anything wrong. "What did you say to him?" Samuel pressed, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I told him the truth," Nathaniel replied. "That dying doesn't hurt if you do it right. That I could show him, but he ran away before I could explain properly." The Reverend's hands shook. He sent Nathaniel to bed without supper and spent the night on his knees in the chapel, begging God for answers that didn't come. He dedicated his life to faith, to serving others, to being a good father. Where had he failed? What darkness had taken root in his child's soul? The following days brought more incidents. The postmaster's cat was found dead, its body arranged in the church cemetery. Nathaniel's fingerprints marked the dirt around it. By mid-October, the Reverend had become a shadow of himself. He conducted services mechanically, his sermons losing their fire as exhaustion and fear consumed him. The congregation noticed but attributed it to grief. Perhaps the anniversary of Margaret's death was approaching, they whispered. They didn't know that Samuel barely slept anymore, spending his nights watching his son's bedroom door, terrified of what the boy might do in darkness. Nathaniel, meanwhile, seemed increasingly detached from reality. He no longer responded to his name consistently. Sometimes he would stare at his father as if looking at a stranger, tilting his head in that unnerving way that made Samuel's skin crawl. The boy stopped attending school after Mrs. Abernathy found him standing over a classmate during recess, holding a sharp rock and murmuring about opening veins to let the badness out. Samuel kept him home, locked in his room during the day, while attending to his pastoral duties. But the isolation only seemed to worsen Nathaniel's condition. The boy covered his walls with increasingly disturbing drawings, figures drowning in red, bodies hanging from trees, and one recurring image that made Samuel's blood freeze. A small child standing over a man in clerical robes, both bathed in crimson. On October 18th, Dr. Pemberton made a house call at Samuel's desperate request. The elderly physician had delivered Nathaniel and treated the Cole family for years. He examined the boy thoroughly while Samuel waited downstairs, pacing and praying. The doctor's face was grave when he descended. "Reverend, I've never seen anything quite like this. Physically, the boy is perfectly healthy, but his affect, his responses, there's something profoundly wrong with his mind. The way he describes hurting others isn't cruel or malicious. It's clinical, curious. He genuinely doesn't understand why it would be wrong. Can you help him?" Samuel's voice cracked with desperation. Pemberton hesitated. "There are asylums, institutions that specialize in disorders of the mind. Philadelphia has one that might—" "No." The word came out sharper than Samuel intended. "I won't send my son away. He needs his father, needs faith and love. God will guide us through this." The doctor placed a weathered hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Sometimes love isn't enough, my friend. Sometimes a child needs more than we can give. At least consider it." After Pemberton left, Samuel sat alone in the chapel, truly alone for the first time in weeks. The weight of his situation crushed down on him. He was a man of God, a spiritual leader, yet he couldn't save his own child from whatever darkness consumed him. Every instinct screamed that Nathaniel needed professional help, institutional care. But pride and fear held him back. What would people say? How could he, who counseled others through their hardest trials, admit he'd failed his own son? That night Samuel made a decision born of desperation. He would perform a spiritual intervention, days of prayer and fasting, reading scripture to Nathaniel, surrounding the boy with God's word until the darkness lifted. It was what he knew, what he'd been trained for. Faith had always been his answer. He began the next morning. Nathaniel sat in a wooden chair in the chapel, while Samuel read from the Bible for hours, pausing only to pray over his son. The boy endured it with that same blank expression, occasionally asking questions that chilled Samuel to his core. "Father, in Exodus, God killed all those children. Was that wrong?" "Nathaniel, that's not— You don't understand the context. But if God can kill, why can't people? Aren't we made in his image?" Samuel had no answers that satisfied either of them. Day after day, he continued this ritual, growing more haggard while Nathaniel remained unchanged. The boy ate when told, sat when commanded, but behind those dark eyes, something waited, something patient and calculating that Samuel was only beginning to recognize. On October 24th, 6 days before the incident, Nathaniel spoke unprompted for the first time in days. "I dream about Mother," Nathaniel said softly, his voice cutting through Samuel's recitation of Psalms. The Reverend stopped mid-sentence, looking at his son with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The boy rarely mentioned Margaret. "What do you dream, son?" Samuel asked gently, setting the Bible aside. Nathaniel's eyes focused somewhere beyond the chapel walls. "She's in a dark place. She can't breathe. She's calling for me, but I can't reach her. There's dirt in her mouth." His tone remained flat, clinical, as if describing something observed rather than felt. Samuel's hands trembled. "Your mother is in heaven, Nathaniel, at peace with God. These are just nightmares." "She tells me things," the boy continued, ignoring his father's words. "She says you killed her. That I killed her. That we're the same, you and me. We both have blood on our hands." The Reverend stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "That's enough. Your mother's death was natural, tragic, but natural. You were an innocent baby." "But she died because of me," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Because I needed to be born. You chose me over her. The doctor said there might be complications, that you could save her but you wanted me. You let her die." Samuel's face drained of color. It was true. During Margaret's difficult labor, Dr. Pemberton had warned that trying to save both mother and child might kill them both. He'd asked Samuel to make a choice if it came to that. The Reverend had prayed desperately, and when the moment arrived, when Pemberton needed an answer, Samuel had chosen his child. Margaret had hemorrhaged, dying within hours of Nathaniel's birth. No one knew this. Samuel had never told another soul about that impossible choice, had buried the guilt so deep he sometimes convinced himself it hadn't happened. Yet somehow his 7-year-old son knew. How? Samuel's voice failed him. "I hear things," Nathaniel said simply. "In the walls, in the ground. Voices that remember everything. They tell me about all the deaths in this town, all the secrets. They say you and I are special, that we understand what others don't." The Reverend backed away, his faith crumbling under the weight of his son's words. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly see what Nathaniel had become, something beyond his understanding, beyond his ability to save. This wasn't a phase or a medical condition. This was something fundamentally broken in his child's soul, a void where empathy and humanity should have lived. That night, Samuel wrote a letter to the asylum in Philadelphia. His hands shook as he detailed his son's behavior, the escalating violence, the complete absence of remorse or emotional connection. He described the boy as a stranger wearing his son's face, something that mimicked human behavior without understanding it. He begged for their help, their expertise, their intervention before something terrible happened. He sealed the letter and placed it on his desk, planning to post it in the morning. But exhaustion overwhelmed him, and he fell asleep in his chair, the letter remaining unsent. Nathaniel found it near midnight. The boy read slowly, sounding out difficult words, comprehending enough to understand what his father intended. He folded it carefully and returned it to the desk exactly as he'd found it. Then he went to the kitchen and selected the sharpest knife from the drawer, the one his father used for carving Sunday roasts. He carried it back to his room and sat on his bed, studying the blade in the moonlight streaming through his window. He felt nothing looking at it. No fear, no excitement, just calm curiosity about what would come next. The voices in his head had been growing louder, more insistent, telling him what needed to happen, what always happened to people who tried to send him away. Tomorrow was Sunday. His father would preach, the congregation would gather, and Nathaniel would show them all what he'd learned from those whispers in the dark, that some children weren't meant to be saved, some darkness couldn't be prayed away, and some blood debts demanded payment in full. He hid the knife beneath his pillow and lay down, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, Nathaniel smiled. Sunday morning arrived with deceptive beauty. Golden sunlight filtered through autumn leaves, painting Ashford Hollow in warm amber tones that belied the darkness gathering in the Cole household. Samuel woke in his study chair, his neck stiff and aching, the unsent letter still resting on his desk. He stared at it for a long moment, then folded it into his pocket. After the service, he told himself. After one more attempt to reach his son through faith and prayer. He found Nathaniel already dressed in his Sunday clothes, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded neatly. The boy's dark hair was combed, his face clean, his expression serene. For a fleeting moment, Samuel saw the child he'd once known, or thought he'd known, and hope flickered weakly in his chest. "Good morning, Father," Nathaniel said softly. His voice carried an unusual warmth, almost affectionate. "I'm ready for church." Samuel nodded, too exhausted for conversation. They walked together across the yard to the chapel, where early arrivals were already gathering. Mrs. Henderson smiled and waved. Mr. Carstairs tipped his hat. Nathaniel returned their greetings with a politeness that seemed genuine, and Samuel felt his resolve waver. Perhaps the boy was improving. Perhaps the prayers were working after all. The chapel filled steadily. Farmers and shopkeepers, widows and young families, all seeking comfort and guidance in the Reverend's words. They settled into worn pews, their voices creating a gentle murmur of conversation and greeting. Nathaniel took his usual place in the back, sitting perfectly still, his small hands resting on the pew in front of him. Samuel stood at the pulpit, looking out at the familiar faces of his congregation. He'd prepared a sermon about forgiveness, about sins too heavy to bear alone, about the necessity of seeking help beyond our own strength. The words felt prophetic now, though he'd written them days ago. He opened his mouth to begin, but something stopped him. Nathaniel was staring at him with an intensity that made Samuel's words die in his throat. The boy's eyes held no malice, no anger, just a profound, unsettling focus, as if he were studying his father's face for the last time, memorizing every detail. Samuel's hand instinctively moved to his pocket, feeling the shape of the letter hidden there. The Reverend forced himself to look away and begin his sermon. His voice sounded hollow in his own ears as he spoke about burdens and grace, about the courage required to admit when we cannot save ourselves. The congregation listened attentively, unaware of the double meaning in every word. Samuel caught Mrs. Abernathy's sympathetic gaze and realized she understood, at least partially, what he was trying to say. Halfway through the service during a hymn, Samuel noticed Nathaniel was no longer in his seat. His heart lurched with panic, but he maintained his composure, leading the congregation through the song while scanning the chapel. The boy was nowhere visible. Perhaps he'd gone to use the privy, Samuel told himself. Perhaps he'd simply needed air. But something felt profoundly wrong. The hair on Samuel's neck stood up, that primitive warning system that transcends rational thought. He concluded the hymn quickly and announced they would take a brief recess, unusual but not unheard of. The congregation stirred, confused but compliant, as Samuel hurried toward the back of the chapel. He found Nathaniel in the small preparation room behind the altar, where sacramental wine and communion bread were stored. The boy stood before the cabinet, the stolen knife in his hand, examining it with clinical detachment. He looked up when Samuel entered, and for the first time in weeks, his expression showed something, not quite emotion, but a flicker of awareness, of purpose. "Nathaniel," Samuel breathed, closing the door behind him to shield this scene from his congregation. "What are you doing?" "You were going to send me away," the boy said calmly, without accusation. "I found your letter. You think I'm broken. Everyone thinks I'm broken." Samuel's hands rose in a placating gesture. "Son, you need help. More help than I can give. It doesn't mean I don't love you." "You loved Mother more," Nathaniel interrupted. "But you let her die anyway. You chose me and then you regretted it. Every time you look at me, you see her death. You see your failure." The truth of it struck Samuel like a physical blow. How had he never realized how transparent his guilt must have been? How many times had he looked at his son and seen Margaret's face, felt the crushing weight of that impossible choice? "I'm sorry," Samuel whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, Nathaniel. For everything. For not being the father you needed. For not seeing how much you were hurting." Nathaniel tilted his head, studying his father's tears with curiosity rather than understanding. "The voices say that blood washes away sin. That's what baptism means, isn't it? Being washed clean. I want to baptize you, Father. I want to wash both of us clean." He stepped forward, the knife catching the light from the small window. Samuel's instinct was to run, to call for help, but something rooted him in place. Perhaps exhaustion, perhaps the crushing weight of his failures, perhaps the simple fact that he couldn't bring himself to fear his own child, no matter what that child had become. He stood frozen as Nathaniel approached, the knife held loosely in the boy's small hand. "You don't want to do this," Samuel said, his voice remarkably steady despite the terror coursing through him. "Whatever voices you're hearing, they're not real. They're lies, Nathaniel. Sickness in your mind that we can treat." "They're more real than you," Nathaniel replied simply. "They've always been there. Even before I was born, they were waiting. Mother heard them too near the end. She told me so in my dreams. She said dying was like falling asleep, and that I would understand someday. That you would too." The boy was close now, within arm's reach. Samuel could grab him, wrestle the knife away, call for the sheriff. But something in Nathaniel's demeanor, that eerie calm, that absolute certainty, told Samuel that resistance would only accelerate whatever was about to happen. His son had made a decision, followed some twisted logic to its inevitable conclusion, and nothing Samuel said would alter that course. "If you do this," Samuel tried again, his voice breaking, "you'll destroy yourself. They'll lock you away forever. You'll never be free." "I'm not free now," Nathaniel said almost sadly. "I'm trapped in this thing people call childhood, expected to feel things I don't feel, to want things I don't want. They look at me and see something wrong, something missing. But maybe I'm not missing anything. Maybe I just see the truth that everyone else pretends doesn't exist." "What truth?" Samuel asked, genuinely wanting to understand, even now, even facing the knife. "That we're all just meat and bone, that death is natural, necessary. That the only thing separating living from dying is timing and opportunity. You made your choice when Mother was dying. Now I'm making mine." Nathaniel moved with sudden, unexpected speed. The knife flashed upward, catching Samuel across the forearm as the Reverend instinctively tried to defend himself. Blood bloomed through the white fabric of his sleeve, and Samuel gasped in shock and pain. He stumbled backward, knocking over a small table laden with communion supplies. The crash would alert the congregation. Help would come. But would it come in time? The boy advanced again, and this time Samuel fought back. He grabbed Nathaniel's wrist, trying to twist the knife free. But the child's grip was surprisingly strong, strengthened by whatever madness drove him. They struggled in the small room, Samuel's blood making everything slippery, his strength waning from shock and blood loss. "Please," Samuel begged, no longer trying to disarm his son, just trying to understand. "Why? Just tell me why." Nathaniel's face was inches from his father's now, those dark eyes boring into Samuel's soul. "Because you made me. Because she died making me. Because someone has to pay for what I am. And it should be you. You chose this when you chose me over her." The logic was insane, yet within Nathaniel's fractured worldview, it held a terrible consistency. Samuel saw it clearly now. His son had constructed an entire philosophy around his own emptiness, had found a way to make sense of the void, where his emotions should have been. And Samuel, in choosing his son's life over his wife's, had become the architect of his own destruction. The door burst open. Sheriff Morrison stood framed in the doorway, his face pale with shock. Behind him, members of the congregation crowded, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as they took in the scene. The bloodied Reverend, the child with the knife. The communion wine spilled like prophecy across the floor. "Nathaniel, put down the knife," Morrison commanded, his hand moving to his pistol. "Right now, boy." But Nathaniel didn't look at the sheriff. He kept his eyes locked on his father, and Samuel saw something flicker across the boy's face. Not quite regret, but perhaps recognition that his opportunity had passed. The moment had been broken by intrusion, the ritual incomplete. "It's all right," Samuel said weakly, addressing the sheriff while never breaking eye contact with his son. "He's just confused, frightened. He didn't mean—" "He cut you, Reverend," Morrison interrupted, moving into the room cautiously. "He clearly meant that." Two other men followed the sheriff, moving to flank Nathaniel. The confrontation froze in terrible tableau. Nathaniel with the bloodied knife, Samuel bleeding and trembling, the sheriff and townsmen poised to intervene, and beyond them the congregation pressed against the doorway, witnessing their spiritual leader's ultimate failure. The weight of all those watching eyes finally broke something in Samuel's chest, and he collapsed to his knees. Whether from blood loss or despair, even he couldn't say. "Don't hurt him," Samuel gasped out, even as Nathaniel still held the weapon. "Please, he's my son. He's sick. He needs help, not punishment." But Morrison had seen enough. He nodded to Jacob Whitmore and Douglas Henderson, who moved in quickly, grabbing Nathaniel's arms and wresting the knife away. The boy didn't resist once the blade was taken. He simply went limp, as if the struggle had drained all animation from him. They held him firmly, while Dr. Pemberton pushed through the crowd to attend to Samuel's wound. "It's not deep," Pemberton announced after examination, though his hands shook as he wrapped the Reverend's arm. "You're fortunate, Samuel. A few inches higher and—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The congregation erupted in frightened whispers. Mrs. Abernathy was crying openly. Several children were ushered quickly from the chapel by their parents. The carefully maintained facade of normalcy in Ashford Hollow had shattered completely, revealing the rot that had been growing beneath their awareness. Morrison stood over Nathaniel, his weathered face heavy with the burden of what came next. "Reverend Cole, I have to take the boy into custody. You understand that, don't you? What happened here? Attempted murder of a parent. There's no way around it." Samuel nodded weakly, unable to form words. He watched as they led Nathaniel toward the door, the boy moving mechanically, his face blank once more. Just before exiting, Nathaniel turned back to look at his father one final time. Their eyes met across the blood-stained room, and Samuel desperately searched for some glimmer of the child he'd loved, some fragment of humanity in that dark gaze. What he saw instead was curiosity, pure, detached, clinical interest in how events were unfolding. Nathaniel was observing his father's pain the way one might watch an insect struggle in a web, fascinating, but ultimately meaningless. Then the boy was gone, taken to the small jail behind the sheriff's office, and Samuel was left surrounded by concerned faces offering comfort he couldn't feel. The next hours passed in a blur. Dr. Pemberton insisted on moving Samuel to his office for proper treatment. Mrs. Henderson and several other women cleaned the chapel, scrubbing away the blood while praying in whispered tones. An emergency town meeting was called for that evening to discuss what should be done about the Reverend's son. Samuel sat in Pemberton's examination room, his arm freshly bandaged, listening to the doctor's gentle suggestions that perhaps now he would reconsider the asylum. The old physician meant well, but his words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through layers of shock and grief that muffled everything. "I failed him," Samuel finally said, his voice hollow. "I saw the signs, and I explained them away. I chose faith over action. I convinced myself that love and prayer would be enough when I knew, God help me, I knew that something was profoundly wrong." "You're a father," Pemberton replied quietly. "Fathers want to believe the best of their children. You're not the first to miss warning signs, and you won't be the last. The question now is what happens next." That evening's town meeting was one of the most painful experiences of Samuel's life. He stood before his congregation and community, his arm throbbing beneath its bandages, and listened to people debate his son's fate. Some argued for immediate transfer to an asylum. Others wanted him tried as an adult, despite his age, given the premeditated nature of his attack. A few, very few, suggested that prayer and spiritual intervention might still save the boy. Morrison presented the facts plainly: the escalating pattern of behavior, the stolen knife, the clear intent to harm. He'd been to the coal house that afternoon and found Nathaniel's room covered in disturbing drawings. The evidence painted a picture of a deeply troubled child who posed a genuine danger to himself and others. "The law is murky here," Morrison admitted. "He's 7 years old. We don't have facilities for a child like this. The nearest institution that might take him is 3 days' travel. And even then," he paused, looking uncomfortable, "even then, they might refuse. His condition is beyond my understanding, beyond most people's experience." Samuel listened to them discuss his son as if Nathaniel were an object, a problem to be solved rather than a child in pain. Yet he couldn't defend the boy, couldn't argue against their conclusions. Everything they said was true. The decision was made that Nathaniel would be held temporarily in the jail, while arrangements were explored for his long-term care. Samuel was granted permission to visit, though Morrison insisted on being present. The Reverend approached the small cell, with dread weighing each step. Unsure what he would say to his son, what words could possibly bridge the chasm between them. Nathaniel sat on the narrow cot, his small frame seeming even smaller in the sparse cell. He looked up when Samuel entered, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, Samuel thought he saw something like recognition in the boy's eyes. But it passed quickly, replaced by that familiar blankness. "Hello, Father," Nathaniel said politely, as if greeting him at breakfast rather than in a jail cell. Samuel pulled a chair close to the bars, his bandaged arm resting carefully in his lap. "Nathaniel, I need you to understand something. What you did today, what you tried to do, that wasn't just wrong. It was evil. Do you understand that word? Evil." The boy considered this carefully. "The Bible is full of killing. Abraham almost killed Isaac. God killed everyone in the flood except Noah's family. Soldiers killed for the promised land. How is what I tried to do different? Context," Samuel said desperately. "Divine purpose. Those were—" He stopped, recognizing the futility. How could he explain moral complexity to a child who felt no morality at all? "You wanted to hurt me, your own father, the person who loves you most in this world." "You don't love me," Nathaniel replied without malice, simply stating what he perceived as fact. "You love who you wanted me to be, but I've never been that person. I tried to pretend, especially when I was younger, But the voices said it was pointless, that you'd figure it out eventually. They were right. Samuel's throat constricted. What voices, Nathaniel? Where do they come from? Inside, outside, everywhere. The boy's voice took on a distant quality. They started before I can remember. They told me about Mother, about how she screamed when I was being born. They showed me what dying looks like from the inside. They explained that most people are liars, pretending to care about each other, when really they're just scared of being alone. That's not true, Samuel protested weakly. Love is real, community is real. The bonds between people are just fear wearing a mask, Nathaniel interrupted. I don't feel fear, so I don't need the mask. That makes me honest, Father. More honest than anyone in this town. Samuel looked at his son, this stranger wearing his child's face, and felt the last vestiges of hope crumble. There would be no breakthrough, no moment of connection or understanding. Nathaniel existed in a reality fundamentally incompatible with human society, and no amount of prayer or love or intervention would change that. Some breaks couldn't be mended. I'm going to send you to Philadelphia, Samuel said quietly, to doctors who specialize in conditions like yours. I should have done it weeks ago. Maybe they can help you, maybe they can't. But I've done all I can. Nathaniel nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already known. The voices said this would happen. They said everyone eventually gives up, even you. Samuel stood, his legs unsteady. He wanted to say something profound, something a father should say to his son in what might be their final conversation. But no words came. The connection between them had been severed, if it had ever truly existed at all. As he turned to leave, Nathaniel spoke one last time. Father? When Mother died, did she say anything? At the very end? Samuel stopped, his back to the cell. She said she loved you, that she hoped you'd have a good life. It was a lie. Margaret had been unconscious for hours before dying, but it was the lie a child should hear, the comfort even this broken boy might need. The voices say she was screaming, Nathaniel replied. They say she knew what I would become, that she tried to warn you but couldn't speak. Samuel left without responding, his heart breaking for the 1000th time. Behind him he heard his son humming softly, a lullaby Margaret used to sing while pregnant. One Nathaniel couldn't possibly remember, yet the melody was perfect, every note precisely placed. 2 days later, on the morning of October 27th, Samuel received word that Nathaniel had stopped eating and drinking. The boy sat in his cell, staring at the wall, unresponsive to all attempts at communication. Dr. Pemberton examined him and found nothing physically wrong, just a child who had decided to stop living. By October 29th, Nathaniel's condition had deteriorated severely. His small body couldn't withstand prolonged deprivation. Samuel kept vigil outside the cell, begging his son to eat, to drink, to choose life. But Nathaniel never responded, never even acknowledged his father's presence. The boy simply stared ahead, his breathing growing shallower, his lips moving in silent conversation with voices only he could hear. He died on October 30th, 1858, at dawn, without ever speaking another word. The doctor listed the cause as self-inflicted starvation, the first documented case of a child deliberately starving himself in the county's history. The town buried him quickly, quietly, in an unmarked grave at the edge of the cemetery. Samuel Cole delivered a eulogy to an empty chapel that evening, his words echoing off bare walls. He spoke about tragedy and loss, about the limits of understanding and the mysterious ways of providence. But mostly he spoke about failure, his failure as a father, as a spiritual guide, as a man who believed faith alone could overcome any darkness. He left Ashford Hollow 3 weeks later, unable to face the place where his son had died and where his own inadequacy had been laid bare. The congregation found a new reverend, and Samuel's name gradually faded from memory, becoming just another sad story in a town full of them. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows through those Pennsylvania hills, people say they hear a child humming, and those who hear it report a strange compulsion, an urge to walk to the old cemetery, to the unmarked grave, to listen for voices in the dark that promise understanding. that explain away guilt and fear, that whisper truths too terrible to accept yet impossible to ignore. Most resist, some don't. And the cycle continues, generation after generation, in the town that forgot Reverend Cole but never quite escaped what his son became, a reminder that some children are born without the light others take for granted, and that sometimes love isn't enough to kindle what was never there to begin with. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.